On the morning of December 4th, 1991, Captain Mark Pyle flew a Boeing 727 called Clipper Goodwill out of New York, knowing Pan Am was in serious trouble. The rescue deal everyone was counting on had collapsed. But no order had come telling the crew not to fly, so they left for Barbados as scheduled. After they landed, the Pan Am station manager walked into the cockpit carrying a telex from New York. Shut down. Bring the airplane home. In Barbados, employees were in tears. Station personnel needed a way home, and Pyle later said he believed the station manager paid for the fuel to Miami on his own personal credit card. He couldn't prove it. What he remembered was how desperate that morning had become. The 727 lifted off for Miami. Approaching the Florida coast, the flight engineer told Pyle something no Pan Am crew had ever heard before. Theirs was now the last revenue Pan Am aircraft still flying anywhere in the world. Miami Tower asked for a flyby. After landing, water cannons arched over the fuselage. Employees lined the ramp and saluted. Pyle later remembered wiping tears from his eyes while he taxied to the gate. Hold those two images side by side. An airline that once built air routes across entire oceans, and a final airplane that may have needed one employee's credit card to get home. This was the company that pioneered scheduled flying across the Pacific, that opened regular transatlantic service, that carried America into the jet age, helped bring the Boeing 747 into existence, and became so certain of its future that it opened a waiting list for flights to the moon. How does that company arrive that afternoon in Miami? Rewind. You're watching Travel District, where we tell the stories of the companies that taught America how to travel. Pan American Airways was incorporated in March of 1927, and by October, after the corporate pieces were stitched together, a young, relentlessly ambitious organizer named Juan Trippe was its president and general manager. The company held one asset that mattered: a United States foreign airmail contract to Cuba. The contract came with a deadline: begin service by mid-October or lose it. The airfield at Key West wasn't ready, and heavy rain had turned the unfinished strip into something Pan Am's Fokkers couldn't use. So on deadline day, the airline that would one day circle the planet chartered somebody else's airplane, a Fairchild float plane, to carry the mail to Havana and keep the contract alive. The future global airline began by borrowing an aircraft because its own had nowhere to land. Pan Am's own Fokker service followed on October 28, 1927. Key West to Havana, 772 pounds of mail, no paying passengers, roughly 70 minutes in the air. Passenger service arrived in January 1928. 7 paying customers, $50 each, to cross about 90 miles of open water. And Pan Am was already selling something larger than transportation. With Bacardi advertising alongside it, the pitch was simple: leave prohibition behind, cross 90 miles of water, and drink rum under the Cuban sun. That's not an airmail story, that's a vacation story. Picture what international air travel meant that morning. A small airfield at the end of Florida, a handful of passengers, mail sacks, and 90 miles of ocean that had just stopped being an obstacle. But Cuba was never the destination. Cuba was the laboratory. Trippe was thinking much, much bigger. Here's the thing that separates Pan Am from nearly every airline that came after it. Today, an airline inherits an aviation system. In the late 1920s, across much of Latin America, almost none of it existed. So as Pan Am pushed through the Caribbean, Central America, and down into South America, it built the system as it went. The radio networks, the navigation, the ground operations that made a printed schedule mean something. Charles Lindbergh himself signed on as a technical advisor, surveying routes for the young airline. Then came the problem no route map could hide. Long paved runways capable of handling large aircraft barely existed across most of the world. Trippe's answer defined the company. If there were no runways, water would be the runway. Pan Am commissioned progressively larger flying boats from Sikorsky, from Martin, and eventually from Boeing. They were called Clippers, after the fastest sailing ships of the century before. Their pilots were captains, and even the uniforms were borrowed from the sea. and the naval tradition went deeper than the uniform. Pan Am captains were treated almost like masters of their ships, and over time, seniority became deeply embedded in the airline's cockpit culture. Pan Am was turning ocean travel into air travel without discarding the romance of the voyage. In November 1935, the China Clipper lifted off from California and began scheduled service across the Pacific, along an airway Pan Am had physically constructed, station by station, through Hawaii, Midway, Wake, Guam, and the Philippines. Pan Am had built stepping stones across the largest ocean on Earth. 4 years later, in 1939, the Boeing 314 opened regular transatlantic service. Travel aboard those clippers would feel almost unrecognizable to a passenger today. Multi-course meals on real china with formal table settings. The Boeing 314 carried a genuine dining salon. Early ocean flying still behaved partly like an ocean voyage. You didn't simply sit down and endure until arrival. You passed time. You dressed for dinner. You talked to strangers. The journey itself was part of the trip, not the tax you paid for it. But this was travel for diplomats, executives, and movie stars. Pan Am had conquered distance. Trip's next target was price. When war came, the routes, crews, and far-flung bases Pan Am had spent years building suddenly became valuable for reasons Trip had never intended. Its aircraft and personnel were pulled into moving people and material around a world at war. But the decision that matters to our story came afterward, and it wasn't about airplanes at all. As early as the 1940s, Trip was publicly arguing for something the industry establishment found almost vulgar: cheap seats. Air travel priced for people who were not rich. Pan Am introduced tourist fares before the jet age arrived and kept pushing toward a genuine mass market for overseas travel. And then Trip did something no airline executive had thought to do. In 1946, he founded a hotel company. The logic was beautifully simple. Pan Am was flying travelers into cities where hotels of an international standard sometimes did not exist. So why should the company's responsibility end at the bottom of the airplane stairs? The brand was called Intercontinental, and its first property opened in Belém, Brazil in 1949. Pan Am wasn't merely building an airline, it was building the journey around the airline, the routes, the aircraft, the terminals, the hotel waiting at the other end. And for the first time, an overseas trip was becoming something a middle-class American family could at least imagine. Save for. Talk about at the dinner table. Then the airplane itself changed, and distance began collapsing. October 26, 1958. Pan Am's Boeing 707, Clipper America, departs New York for Paris, the first scheduled jet service by a United States airline. 111 passengers, 11 crew, about 8.5 hours including a fuel stop at Gander. The 707 cruised around 555 miles per hour, but the numbers matter less than what they did to geography. Europe moved closer. A crossing once measured in days, then in a long night of piston engine droning, became an evening. Dinner over the Atlantic. Breakfast in Paris. Pan Am paired the jet with cheaper economy fares, and overseas traffic surged. The blue globe on the tail was becoming one of the visual signatures of international travel, a logo that meant the same thing in New York, London, and Tokyo. On board, Pan Am sold the jet journey as an experience. By the mid-1960s, there were movies in the cabin and audio channels in the armrest. At JFK, the company even built a terminal to match the moment. The Worldport, a great flying saucer roof wrapped around the airplanes beneath it, a building that made departure itself feel like the space age. Pan Am did not invent every technology of the jet age. What it did was teach Americans what the jet age was supposed to feel like. And then Juan Trippe went to Boeing and asked for something much larger, and his greatest triumph began becoming his greatest gamble. The Boeing 747 exists in large part because Juan Trippe wanted it to. Pan Am's commitment was staggering. It was the largest commercial aircraft order the industry had seen, for an airplane designed substantially around Pan Am's appetite for capacity. Trippe wasn't just buying an airplane. He was betting that the growth curve of the jet age would keep climbing. In 1966, he was telling Pan Am's board that traffic could grow around 15% a year well into the next decade. At the time, it didn't sound reckless. It sounded like history continuing in a straight line. Tripp retired in 1968, 2 years before the first Pan Am 747 entered service. The man who had spent 40 years pushing aviation toward the future would not be the one managing the largest bet he had ever placed. He had ordered the future. His successors would have to live inside it. The passengers who boarded the 747 would see the staircase and the lounge. What they couldn't see was how much Pan Am had bet on every one of those seats eventually being filled. The first commercial 747 flight left New York for London in January 1970, and it did not begin flawlessly. A technical problem forced every passenger off the original aircraft and onto a replacement after a long delay. The newest wonder of the jet age still had to make it out of the gate. But consider what one passenger carried away from that night. Glenn Little was a child then, traveling with his father on that inaugural flight. Decades later, what stayed with him wasn't a statistic. It was the sheer size of the airplane. 2 aisles, a spiral staircase, the blue Pan Am uniforms, and the attentiveness of the crew. Even the smell, a new airplane mixed with jet fuel. Not a spreadsheet entry, a memory factory. Upstairs, Pan Am's 747s offered a lounge and restaurant-style dining, drawing on a luxury lineage that ran through real china, formal meals, even cuisine associated with Maxims of Paris. Most passengers never ate Maxims upstairs, but they still walked beneath that staircase. They still received the meal tray, unfolded the route map from the seat pocket, and understood that the same blue globe outside the window would be waiting on a jet bridge in another country when they landed. The glamour at the top of the airplane colored the experience of everyone aboard it. By 1970, Pan Am was carrying roughly 11 million passengers to more than 80 countries. The airline that had begun with mail sacks and 90 miles of water now seemed to have put the entire planet on its route map. Pan Am's confidence by then was extraordinary. When Stanley Kubrick made 2001, A Space Odyssey, the spaceplane carrying passengers to orbit wore the Pan Am globe. And the company didn't stop at Hollywood. Pan Am opened an actual waiting list for future trips to the moon, the first Moon Flights Club. People signed up. For a while, it all seemed to be working. The problem was that Pan Am had become very good at imagining the future, and increasingly bad at imagining a future that didn't look like its past. Then came the 1973 oil shock. Fuel prices exploded, travel demand weakened, and the airplane built to make Pan Am richer by carrying more people became brutally expensive when Pan Am couldn't fill the seats. The upstairs lounge still looked glamorous. The empty seats underneath it did not. And beneath all of it, Pan Am carried a structural weakness most of its passengers never saw. Here is the strange truth about America's most famous international airline. For half a century, United States regulation had largely kept Pan Am out of its own domestic market. Pan Am could take you to London, to Paris, to Tokyo, to Rio. What it could not do was fly you from Kansas City to New York to catch that flight to London. United could. American could. Delta could. The big domestic carriers owned vast networks inside the United States, networks that gathered passengers from 100 cities and funneled them toward the coasts. Pan Am had spent 50 years building routes into the rest of the world. What it had never been allowed to build was enough of a route through America itself. Under the old rules, that weakness was survivable. Everyone stayed in their lane because the government drew the lanes. And here is the part Pan Am itself may not have fully appreciated. The company had spent decades resenting those rules. But the same regulatory architecture that kept Pan Am out of America's domestic market had also helped keep America's domestic giants from chasing Pan Am overseas. The cage was also part of the armor. Then, starting in 1978, deregulation dismantled the old order, and both protections came apart. The domestic giants were increasingly free to push across the oceans, and the airlines that had once delivered passengers to Pan Am's gates could now carry those passengers all the way to London themselves. The rules Pan Am had spent decades fighting had finally changed. So why didn't that save it? Because Pan Am now needed the one thing it had spent half a century without, and building a domestic network from scratch would take years. Pan Am no longer had, and money it could no longer afford to spend. National Airlines looked like the shortcut. On paper, it made perfect sense. In 1980, Pan Am acquired National Airlines to obtain the domestic network it had wanted for years. Pan Am had the world. National had America. Put them together, and the map finally closed. Except the map is not the airline. The acquisition came out of a bidding contest, and it came in expensive. And for the people flying the airplanes, the merger wasn't a line on an organization chart. Remember that cockpit culture Pan Am had carried since the flying boats, the sea captains, the seniority? A Pan Am co-pilot who had waited 15 years for the left seat could suddenly find himself competing for that promotion with a national pilot hired only a few years earlier. The fight over the seniority lists became bitter enough to go to arbitration. Buying National solved the map. It created another problem inside the cockpit. And even if Pan Am could somehow merge the people, there was a bigger problem waiting underneath. It had bought a domestic network, but not the one it needed. National's routes never aligned into a feeder system pouring passengers into Pan Am's overseas gateways. And while Pan Am struggled to absorb National, another oil shock drove fuel costs sharply higher. In the first quarter of 1980 alone, Pan Am lost roughly $75 million. The employees were asked to help fund the survival themselves. Pay was cut and then frozen. Pan Am suspended some of its pension contributions. In 1985, 4 of its 5 major unions went on strike, and Pan Am kept selling. First went the building, the famous Pan Am headquarters towering over Park Avenue. Then went Intercontinental, the hotel's Trip had created so the journey wouldn't end at the airplane door. Then, in 1985, the company sold something no one had imagined it would ever part with: the Pacific. The airline of the China Clipper sold its entire Pacific division to United for roughly $750 million. And the buyer's logic was the cruelest part. United could do what Pan Am couldn't: pour passengers from an enormous domestic network into those Pacific gateways. Then it sold the ocean it had taught commercial aviation how to cross. The Pacific sale helped Pan Am post a profit in 1985. It would be the last profitable year the airline ever had. And yet, Pan Am was not dead. By 1988, there were signs a recovery might still be possible. Employees allowed themselves some optimism. Then came December 21st. On December 21st, 1988, a terrorist bomb destroyed Pan Am Flight 103 over the town of Lockerbie, Scotland. All 259 people aboard were killed, along with 11 people on the ground. 270 human beings. That is not a plot twist in a business story. It is a mass murder, and it deserves to be stated plainly and left there for a moment. The corporate consequence followed. Bookings collapsed, just as the workforce had finally begun to believe in the company again. And the damage became visible in the most painful way an airline can show it. The 747s, the airplanes that had once represented abundance itself, began crossing the Atlantic with rows and rows of empty seats while the company scrambled to raise cash, selling aircraft to keep operating. Lockerbie alone did not destroy Pan Am. It struck an airline that had already spent a decade selling its own future, an airline with almost no cushion left. Then, the world piled on. Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990. Fuel costs climbed while recession and fear kept Americans off international flights. By then, Pan Am was no longer asking how to become great again. It was asking what it could sell to survive the next month. The answer included its prized routes into London Heathrow. In January 1991, Pan Am filed for bankruptcy. Delta acquired the core European operations in the Northeast Shuttle, while a much smaller Pan Am tried to survive around Latin America. It wasn't enough. So what killed Pan Am? Not deregulation alone, not the national merger, not the oil shocks, not Lockerbie. Pan Am entered deregulation with a weakness that decades of regulation had written into its network. It spent heavily trying to fix it. The fix failed. Then every crisis forced it to sell another piece of the company that might have helped it survive the next one. Pan Am did not suffer one fatal blow. It ran out of things left to lose. Which brings us back to December 4th. Clipper Goodwill, inbound to Miami, the last one flying. The tower asks for a flyby. The water cannons rise. The people standing on that ramp weren't only saying goodbye to an airplane. Many had spent decades with Pan Am. By the time those engines stopped, thousands of them no longer had a company to come back to the next morning. They stood there anyway, and they saluted. After 64 years of connecting America to the world, Pan Am stops moving. But look at what didn't stop. Pan Am opened the Pacific in 1935 and regular transatlantic service in 1939. It put Americans on scheduled jets in 1958 and put the 747 into service in 1970, and the wide-body era that followed owes an enormous debt to that decision. The hotel company Juan Trippe founded because his passengers needed somewhere to sleep is still checking in guests tonight. It's called Intercontinental. The Worldport, that flying saucer terminal that once made departure feel like the space age, outlived the airline by more than 2 decades. In 2013, it was demolished. And yet what people actually kept was never a route map. It's the globe, the uniform, the flight bag slung over a shoulder in 1,000 family photos, the menu somebody saved, the spiral staircase, the first sight of a 747 filling a terminal window, the quiet shock of boarding an airplane in New York, and hours later, opening a door onto another country. Juan Trippe built Pan Am by refusing to believe the world had to stay the way it was. The tragedy was that when the world finally changed in ways Pan Am had not predicted, the company no longer had enough time, money, or room for error to remake itself again. But the world Pan Am spent 6 decades building did not disappear. International flying simply became so ordinary that we stopped noticing how extraordinary it was. On December 4th, 1991, one last Clipper came home to Miami, and Pan Am never flew another passenger. But every time an American walks into an airport believing the other side of the world is only a flight away, they're living inside a travel culture Pan Am helped build. One route, one Clipper, one blue globe at a time. If you ever flew Pan Am, drop a comment below. Tell us the year, the route, and the one detail you still remember. The globe, the meal, the uniform, the staircase, or simply who was sitting next to you. The route maps can tell us where Pan Am went. The people who flew it can tell us what the trip felt like. Subscribe to Travel District, because this is where we preserve the stories of the companies that taught America how to travel.